Thank you, colleagues, for taking that abbreviated break. I do appreciate it. We'd like to resume the program. And at this stage of the program, we're going to focus on our keynote, and I'll be introducing Professor Sylvia Gerardo in a moment. But I want to point something out that Susan Carlson mentioned when she was sharing the data. In the third data slide, she pointed out a column on resignations, right? And often we don't know why when we look at separation, but by separating out resignations, she was better able to tell us what proportion, in this case of URMs, are resigning, right? And so when I looked at that data, it occurred to me that recruitment is so important, but it's actually just the start, right? And as Susan noted in her data, that over the past 2 years, UC as an aggregate system has achieved 1 out of 5 or 1 out of 4 hires who identify from an underrepresented population, which is a staggering achievement. There have been years where not a single underrepresented minority has been hired. Think about that. And so this augurs well for change, but also it means that recruitment is not enough. And if anything, it makes mentoring all the more important because we can ill afford to lose any faculty, but we certainly can't afford to lose women, particularly in STEM fields, where they're underrepresented in many fields outside of biological sciences, or underrepresented minority faculty across all disciplines. And so I'm particularly grateful that Sylvia Gerardo is here to share her keynote on culturally aware mentoring. Often when we ask people, is mentoring going on? Everyone says absolutely. But if you ask them what it actually means, or what the experience is like for people on the other end, it gets a bit more complicated. Sylvia Gerardo is known to many of you. She's a professor in the Graduate School of Education and Information and served as a director of the Higher Education Research Institute at the University of California, Los Angeles for more than a decade. Before her service at UCLA, she also served as director of the Center for the Study of Higher Education and Post-Secondary Education at the University of Michigan. She has written extensively on racial campus climate, the experiences of underrepresented identity groups in college, and diversity in higher education. I'm going to continue this, in part because she is a system-wide resource and a national asset. She's published well over 100 articles, 7 books, monographs, and co-edited 2 books that won awards from the International Latino Book Awards in 2016 for Hispanic serving institutions, and in 2017 for the Magic Key, the educational journey of Mexican Americans from K through 12 to college and beyond. She's received a number of research-based awards, and so I am particularly grateful that she said yes to the invitation. Look forward to her observations on culturally aware mentoring.
I have a stool here because these things are not culturally responsive. Podiums are not. I don't know why the arrow's not working. Oh, there it is. So a couple of things. I want to build on some of the issues that came up in the earlier sessions. And one of them is really thinking about culture change and the institution or institutional transformation. That sounds really huge, right? So let's kind of walk it back and think about the practices, but also how we bring people to those practices. And another component of that, as you're thinking about initiating new or ongoing kinds of interventions, we call them interventions to try to make things right, or revisioning of what the campus is doing, to actually have an evaluation component. So I'm going to talk about like 3 studies that are in process, so I can't share all of it, but I also have some names where you can look up the articles that have been published fairly recently and see the wonderful work that people have been doing. And it's kind of 3 different projects I'm involved in currently. So let me just start with, and we heard earlier on, and I looked at the 2020 accountability report where faculty from historically underrepresented communities comprised about 70% of new hires, but 21% of separations, and then overall 11% in ladder rank at UC. So I think probably some of those numbers have been updated system-wise. But a couple of things I want to bring your attention to 2 young scholars, Roman Lira and Damani White-Lewis, who was supposed to present with me today, but he got an offer from the University of Pennsylvania, and he's visiting there today. But I want to make sure you know his work, because yes, wonderful, wonderful stuff. We tried, but we were too slow in providing recruitment for him. But anyway, but he'll be continuing to do this work, and he's been working with folks in UC. So one of the things they've come to understand is that persistent efforts to increase racial equity in faculty and search selection. We've just talked about some initiatives today, but we have implicit bias trainings for our search committees. We have, I'm not sure why that happened. And then we also have processes where we stop to do the availability pool check, to check the search plan, and also to understand the finalists before they come to campus. We have those processes in place. But departments still result in lack of, let's just say, diverse hires. So I want to say, while we're always looking at the numbers, the end result, we need to be more attentive to evaluation of the processes involved. And that's where we're trying to figure out what works. So I want to introduce, and this is really the work of these young scholars, is Roman Lira and Damani White-Lewis are really starting to think about evaluating mentoring as an equity criterion that might advance faculty diversity. To start with mentoring, and so I'm going to give you an example. And if I can't answer any questions, Damani's agreed to do a workshop for all of you in the fall that will particularly focus on the hiring and the mentor professorship program. So the issues are connected because we think we're going to hire people who are different, who are going to have some of these skills already. So part of the critical need to diversify the professoriate, but we also have our long-term faculty that are going to be making decisions, that are tenured, that have been there for many years and will continue to influence what that department looks like for many years to come. So how do we actually begin to create more culturally mentors among existing faculty? So those issues, I think, are connected. So I want to go into an institutional transformation framework. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but because I heard the issues of culture change, I thought it would be good. We think the data, and we use this, and we're getting better at using this, is going to be important to changing minds. And you might change some minds, but you're not going to change behaviors yet. This is an organizational learning process model here and institutional transformation. So generally, we are a research organization. We should be informed by data, right, to understand what we're doing. And we're going to change some mindsets. But really, some of these external pressures and opportunities we've been talking about today is what begins to accelerate the process. But in order to change behaviors, people don't know what to do, right? So training and development is very important, and I'm going to talk about some faculty development as it relates to mentoring. But once you train those individuals, then we think of the theoretical framework in terms of organizational learning is those individuals go and diffuse the knowledge through the organization by talking about what they know, what they've learned, how to do things differently, and then start to try to introduce changes in the department. Now, all of that is very important with some leadership support, we found. By the way, this model comes from looking at 11 campuses in STEM and looking at the transformations they were trying to do from teaching and learning to a broader way of things to increase the diversity. So another component in STEP externally is really important is the buy-in and relationships that you begin to get by changing those behaviors. And teaching and learning people have been really good at understanding, well, let's see, someone in Nebraska called them the tail twisters. Who are the tail twisters in the department? In other words, the opinion leaders, right? Can we bring those faculty in to help shed or actually increase the buy-in? And then really thinking about sustaining change and support by supports, rewards, et cetera. But an important part of that is accountability, right? And then that brings us back to the data. So this gives you just sort of an organizational learning and change model that you might want to use in terms of thinking about it. So for me, then, the training and development has been something that I've been working with in a couple of projects, and Damani has as well. So training and development. Okay, so I just put my things together for promotion. I won't say what step because I'm getting pretty up there. But anyway, I will say that this is what my materials look like, right? It's sort of like this. Then you add a diversity statement at the end, and you do all of this. Well, what if it looked like this? It started with mentoring. Diversity is integrated throughout, right? Research, teaching, and service. We have to train people to look at these things, but we also have to think about our processes and saying, okay, let's reorganize that personal statement so that it looks different. So having just put it together, I realize. And so I think what the new young researchers are doing is they're actually thinking about how to really integrate mentoring so it becomes front and center. And so one way is through this mentor-professor program. And they've been studying it. Damani has some data, preliminary data. I have a little bit of preliminary data, but he'll be sharing much more in the fall. And the recognition is that slope of change to what we think are best practices is really quite slow. And it won't meaningfully improve without significant more intervention. In other words, for everything we've done, and we you praised, you said, hey, we're at 20% now. That's amazing because we weren't there. The slope is really still slow when we look at it. So one of the things that a mentor professor, if you start really thinking about you're going to hire mentors, right? It narrows the pool to this key merit criteria that we want to see kind of leadership and mentorship. The other thing is it expands the pool through using more division-wide searches. So this is the model that's being implemented, that's being studied currently. So the standard search is obviously you've got a departmental committee. They're looking for subject areas, what they need to teach, what area of research they want to be highlighted in terms of what they want to do next as a department. They do the research evaluation. Then I told Damani, there's more specifics than everything else, but everything else is there. You have the phone interviews, and then you have campus visits and the finalists. So with the mentor-professor search, it's starting a little bit differently, where these are FTEs come from the provost, and they go to a division. So it's a divisional first stage of selection. And they're looking at mentoring and evaluating that first. Then they pick individuals that are stellar and then have the different departments say, that's going to be our candidate. And there's a little bit of competition, but surprisingly, Damani says, in actually studying the process, there really wasn't that much infighting or anything. He said it was really kind of thought of this as an opportunity. So, as I said, the ongoing evaluation will be shared in fall. So a couple of things, and he had actually a lot of preliminary data. I said, let me just share a couple of tidbits so you just get a taste in the fall, you'll be able to do that. So here's a search committee member who is really thinking, the advantage of evaluating mentoring first was that that was the main goal of the search. No matter how novel or Nobel Prize winning potential they had, if they didn't have a heart for mentoring, we did not want them. And only that first, because otherwise you can get swayed. You're like, well, maybe they haven't done so much mentoring, but look at how much prestige they would bring to the university. We've got a lot of prestige. And most of these mentoring candidates, by the way, are extremely stellar, but they have a heart for mentoring. But that's not what we're looking for. We did not look at that, at least not until after the first hurdle of really the mentor evaluation was crossed. Okay, so what does a candidate say? Well, hired already. Basically, this mentor professor said, I helped create an organization at another university to promote community among scientists. When I was being recruited at other places, they all kind of gave me a pat on the back for that. Then they said, it's going to be great to continue those kinds of efforts when you get here, but on top of what else you're expected to do. Whereas this position, it was an explicit expectation. So for me, the fact that it was part of what I was expected to do and it was part of what I was going to be promoted based on was important. And we actually have a few people right in the recruitment process that have offers elsewhere. And they've basically said, no, I want to start a program. I want to start a program for students in STEM. I want to do this. And I know it's going to be rewarded here because other places it's not. So it's still new, so we'll see. We'll follow this further. So the mentor program kind of changes the focus and the norms by elevating mentoring. And the inclusion and placement of mentoring impacts how search committees recruit, evaluate, and onboard candidates. It attracts racially minoritized scholars who are already engaged in some of this work. The question is, how do we keep these mentors up to date in culturally aware practices? And how do we make mentoring the entire department a priority to prevent burnout? Because then everything falls on this particular professor. So this is just preliminary. He's got a lot of great stuff on the process and how it works. So I want to really turn to faculty mentor training, which is the focus of two other projects that I'm currently evaluating now, is really think about, even with the initial hire, we still need more mentoring and mentor training, and also the new hires. I really think the new hires process, we think that that's a very slow way of institutional transformation. It's called cohort replacement, right? That's our model now. It's like, okay, we'll just work with the new folks. We'll just kind of do the hires. You need to do something with the entire faculty. So, and we can't expect only the few to do all of the mentoring. So let's take a look at a couple of projects. So I want to say something about culturally aware mentoring. There are several kinds that are out there in the universe that have been engaged in. One is the brand culturally aware mentoring that started at Wisconsin with an NIH grant as part of the National Research Mentoring Network. They have trained facilitators. I know that there was some training done at UCSF with a number of individuals when in its initial piloting phase, but now it's really moved. We now have about 30 campuses involved, and I'm involved in the organizational change aspect of those campuses. So if you want to learn more about that particular kind of cultural mentoring, Angela Byers-Winston, she's got a number of publications. They also have a website, and all of this is in this PowerPoint, which you have access to as well. So you can click on those links to see what's going on, and they list the campuses that are engaged in that national project. I am part of that national project, and I want to say a couple things quickly, because I know you're thinking about tools. One is all the culturally aware competencies, behaviors, attitudes are now validated measures that can be used. And we just introduced a climate dimension for the department, and we're in the process of using those 30 plus campuses to validate the measures. We just finished a paper last week and presented it, and we'll probably have a paper out fairly soon on how these faculty viewed the climate of the department, because we're interested in the organizational part. Wisconsin's interested in individual change and how faculty change their attitudes and behaviors as a result of the mentor training. So it's very empirically based practice, but also we want to understand how this works and how it might work at the individual and organizational level. So there are also things, I want to say something about the culturally aware mentoring. It's almost second level training, because faculty have to be introduced to what mentoring is typically. And there's a lot of different, again, the National Research Mentoring Network has a lot of compacts. They have ways of really handling this. And they have a strong entering mentoring. I think it's both online, and they also have trainers, master trainers in the entering mentoring. I know several people probably have participated in UC in the entering mentoring. And so they do have a They've introduced a culturally, racially specific module into the entering mentoring, but I would say it's very preliminary. It's just basically addressing a little bit of diversity. And then, of course, a lot of institutions have developed their own trainings. And, they've developed their homegrown models and they want to do this, but it's not what I would say, it's not nationally validated, or there's no way to assure, there could be a really good master trainer and then another one that was not as good, so you don't know. So, but at least those national ones, they're actually kind of certifying master trainers in some of those areas. So we define culturally mentoring as mentoring practice in which mentors recognize their own culturally shaped beliefs and perceptions and judgments and are cognizant of the cultural differences and similarities between themselves and the mentees. Now, the project that I'm currently engaged in is with biomedical faculty in research training because it's NIH funded, obviously. But it's really focused in that area, and we're working at the graduate level. But I'm going to present, we do have a paper that we did looking at the NIH Build initiatives where faculty were involved in some of that training at the undergraduate level. There we go. Okay, so the paper is called Moving the Science Forward. You can access it in CBE Life Science Education. We did a webinar on it, so that should be also in CBE Life Science Education link. If you go up there, you'll see our webinar presenting this. They do this now with articles, which is wonderful. So we're looking at faculty perceptions of what did they get out of these trainings. And, you think, well, they'll get out what they need to get out, but you need to check back to find out what they say about them. What challenges do they face in participating, and how can they be supported to mitigate some of those challenges? So with any faculty development, and I think most folks are doing this, I know Michigan is doing it, it's almost like a 3-phase training that's now happening. It's initially to get people with the basic concepts and ideas, and then introduce scenarios so that they actually have good techniques, and then also then to kind of give them another round of training, really at a more advanced level, to address particular issues. So, as I said, this particular one is at the undergraduate level, and so the focus was really any kind of culturally diverse mentor training. We call that, so we distinguish it from the actual CAM brand of training. So the question is, what are the perceived benefits, costs, and supports for faculty engaging in this type of training at the 10 NIH Build funded institutions? It was a qualitative study because we were interested in process and also organizational issues. About 74 faculty were interviewed that participated. And then we analyzed them through social exchange theory about the benefits, costs, and supports. So what did we find? So results of the training. One of the things that was pretty clear initially from faculty as they talked about their involvement is it challenged their notions is it's not the same when I was an undergraduate. It challenged notions of what was a traditional college student. They encountered housing insecurity, familiar responsibilities, primary and secondary jobs, and also they began to really have more realization and awareness about hostile campus environments, both by having conversations with their mentees, but also understanding and being able to see it once the training occurs. So Dr. Lee says, rather than me having certain assumptions about her motivation, her mentee, or drive, we would have these discussions where I find out the student has multiple commitments and she doesn't have a parking permit in campus. She was doing some of her work in the car. So I supported her by getting a parking permit for her. I'm not sure if that was the final solution to that but imagine the faculty are not even considering the broad array of issues that students are encountering in their lives, which happens also at the graduate level, obviously. There was also the training. Again, this faculty talks about moving the science forward. The first step was then taking the step to have these more vulnerable conversations sharing their educational journey, their career trajectory, their own, and then also with their mentee, and some personal experiences, and then also discussing race and identity issues that are not often discussed, obviously, in the lab. In this case, we were really trying to look at advancing research training, diversifying the biomedical workforce, so obviously it was really important. So there are also these mentoring compacts, that there's agreements and discussions between the mentor and mentee. Those are really forcing good and tough conversations that I think probably we would have avoided. They also help me, which I like, talk to my students about my vulnerabilities and what I can improve on. That is, there's usually an element within these compacts that ask, what can the advisor do, or what can the mentor do to facilitate career development. So challenges. So, we can think about all the challenges. Of course, the big one is, how do we incorporate this into the evaluation system? But one of the challenges is in how to communicate with students. And a faculty member says it takes a significant amount of time and effort. Dr. Ray says, sometimes I have a student say, I don't know how to get health insurance. That's not what I feel like I'm supposed to be doing. But those are the challenges nonetheless, and I feel like they have difficulty getting money, or maybe family problems they have to overcome. Some of them are expecting that's what the mentor does. That's not what my mentor did. I'm at a loss for that. So really thinking about some of these other issues, and I think with COVID, some of these became much more evident to all of us, because we could see them online, their families, and the issues that they all encountered, particularly those that fell ill. So challenges in who delivers the mentor training. The professional development they're doing isn't going to work in math. It isn't even going to work in communications. It's a different model that needs to be different for each discipline, and that's need to be supported. We have heard that a lot for STEM faculty. They don't want Sylvia Hurtado to come from the School of Education and give them a training because I'm not in their discipline. They really are looking for people in their discipline. So we have to think about individuals within the disciplinary areas who can be trained to offer some of this training, because it's just, we've heard it at a number of campuses at teaching intensive institutions. We've also heard it at research intensive institutions. So structured supports. Now here's the one thing, is that you give people these new tools, they're able to use that. They still need support within the institution, even after you've trained. So after the faculty development, there's some institutional support. So some campuses have developed learning communities. They've actually created complementary curricula. For example, within the research frame, since we're talking about STEM, they've offered coursework where they can actually talk about elements of the research process, so that actually facilitates what's going on between the faculty and the student. They have tiered mentoring for research, career, and peers. And one way to think about it, the National Academy of Sciences, we were just in a consensus panel report that was released a couple of years ago on the science of effective mentoring in STEM. It's a great, great volume because it has all the research on mentoring and what's effective. One of the effective practices was to think about mentors as filling different roles, from navigating the political system to functional or instrumental, which means letters of recommendation, to personal and psychological support. There's different roles, and so you could have multiple mentors for any individual, whether that be a junior person or thinking about a student, to say, help them actually look for other mentors that they can have. So one faculty member said, I had never gone through that kind of training where we talked about communication. It's interesting how communication is a big issue, that really thinking and building that, and how to set up reasonable goals with students. And I really like discussing among faculty from different disciplines to see what concerns people had. And each of us personally pitched in. It was helpful. So really to have a community of mentors working together to help inform each other, maybe problem solve, probably was very useful, particularly during the COVID era. Okay, implications, and then I'm open to all and any questions. So culturally diverse mentor training we think also requires updates as norms shift. And I was hearing that from UC Davis as the training for those committees. You're saying, okay, now we need to kind of tweak this to make sure we're getting at the issues that committees are dealing with. So one thing is thinking about awareness versus competency. Now, this always scares people when you say culturally responsive or culturally aware. They're thinking, I don't know anything about particular identity or backgrounds. How can I do this? Well, it's the awareness that we can develop. The competencies are measured through another instrument, actually, to really think about it. And those are outlined very clearly in people who've done a lot of work in developing that instrument and what are the key aspects that require competency. So I always tell people it's more about a whole range of skills, active listening skills, being able to manage conflict, which of course faculty and students are not really good at, but really thinking about what can do. And you know what? One of the tools, asking questions. Very key and actually diminishing conflict that might occur to create a greater understanding and understand better, or clear out the assumptions that might be on the table at the beginning of that relationship or in the middle of this conversation that you're having. So there's a lot of strategies that people have been learned and being implemented, and we do that within the training as well. The training requires embedded supports that distribute workload, like tiered mentoring or complementary curricula that can actually advance students and also advance some of the mentors on campus. And then, as I said, faculty prefer disciplinary training, but also interdisciplinary support was much regarded and very useful. So what would we do in the future is really to continue to evaluate some of these emergent training models to understand how they work, the practices work, and then provide some validated instruments, which actually there's a lot of instruments available on the National Research Mentoring website. So as soon as our departmental climate items are validated, we're going to be uploading it to the library of the National Research Mentoring Network, and anyone can use those instruments. And they'll be validated, so that's the great thing. So we do have validated measures. It's not like we have to figure out, well, what is the root, how do you measure this? People have been doing it, scholarship is there, and there are validated measures in place, and the tools are there for you to use now. So resources, of course, the National Research Mentoring Network. Just click on the link. They were initially, the first 5 years of NIH, they were involved in training and trainers and piloting a lot of things. Now it's all about research as well. And by national research, they meant how do we mentor others in research process? That's the focus. That's been the focus. So it's at all the different levels that they have the mentoring network, but it's really focused on really thinking about becoming better researchers because NIH funded it, so that's the way. Okay, so here's the article on moving the science forward. As I said, if you go to their website, you can look at our recorded webinar, but it's a nice article. But let me just say, for Damani White-Leas, he's got 3 articles already on search processes. And, it started from his dissertation, but it's like before the ad, this fluid concept of fit, which changes as the committee deliberates. Really interesting. Because he was able to talk to committees, he got into the process of depth that when you go into other articles on faculty hiring and search, they've actually never delved into the committee deliberations and issues that came up. And even how a failed search occurs, which of course, that's the nightmare of every faculty department chair, obviously. So really good stuff. So he's got about 3 or 4 articles already. We have this one together on the mentoring component of the BUILD initiative, but there's certainly more to come. So definitely, if you want to learn more about what we're doing with 33 R1 institutions in terms of introducing cultural mentoring, we're going to have a lot of stuff coming out of that. I think we've just collected data on most of the campuses except for maybe 1 or 2. And so we're already doing that analysis, and we're going to start our case studies of a couple of institutions to understand what happens after the training occurs within departments. So we'll be looking at that specifically. So that's the research for the future. I'm really excited because this is my area of research and you're doing the work. So I'm really open to questions, ideas, and things we might look at, and happy to answer anything. I I know it was a lot because I did 3 different evaluations of different kinds of initiatives, but hopefully that's helpful.
I guess I'll start. That was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much, Sylvia. I scurried a lot of different notes. I love the idea about sort of cultural mentoring being first in the search process, right? Really evaluating that as a first cut. What strikes me is that that's difficult to measure in some ways, right? You can get some of that information from someone's contributions to diversity, equity, inclusion statements. But as we know from doing the STED workshop and having a whole breakout session on how to evaluate those, one of the key challenges is aspiration versus proven record of doing that. And of course, that changes across discipline, right? So if you have been embedded in a lab culture, especially in the STEM sciences or neuroscience, which is mine, you have not necessarily had the space to expand that, right? So what were the challenges that you've found in terms of really evaluating whether someone was going to be a dynamite mentor if they didn't have that proven track record, right? So if someone says, I developed a program, that's excellent, but most of the assistant professors won't have had the opportunity to do that, or at least not to the same degree. So I'd love to hear how you have navigated that.
That's a really good question. This is Damani's research, so he knows the intricate. And I pushed him on that very question because I said they want to know what the criteria are. So I'm going to have to defer on it. That's a very important question, but he knows the program intimately more than I do. I'm on the same campus, but I don't know all the criteria. And he said they came up with a set of criteria that was pretty standard they could use, and it's working. So I doubt it as well, but I'm going to have to defer that question. So I'm sorry.
Thank you for bringing together so many different projects. It's really exciting to see them next to one another. And the mentoring professor project is partially funded by the Advancing Faculty Diversity, so we're very proud to be connected to that one. I wanted everyone to know that you referred to your own advancement process and the inadequacy of the categories we now work on. So one of the things we're working on right now for the APM is to increase the presence of mentoring in the teaching section. And so next fall, actually, there will be a set of revisions to the APM going out that we're working on right now. Diane O'Dowd and others in academic personnel in particular have been working on how to ensure that we mean it when we talk about mentoring and that people actually get rewarded. So look for that, and we'll be looking for all kinds of feedback on that.
All right, great.
Two really quick questions, I hope. One is, as a faculty member, engaging in mentoring training, I'm always struck by the fact that it's the culturally unique people who are voluntarily taking the culturally aware mentoring training, and it's been difficult to get the faculty, more traditional faculty, to participate in. I don't know if any tools arise in this work that you're doing to try to encourage that. And the other thing that struck me here was the role of mentoring in this evaluation process that Susan was alluding to, because in PPFP, when we're selecting postdocs for awards, we have essentially 3 main components of selection, and one of them is demonstrated contributions to diversity and mentoring. And so the program itself is selecting people that are already engaged in that act of reaching out and making change at an early stage. And that might provide some insight into the long-term success of these fellows over time as achieving tenure and being engaged in leadership activities and things. So it was an interesting thing. I thought, oh my gosh, that might be the secret sauce.
That's a great comment. I do want to say, now I'm thinking about the junior people, that there are people who've been involved with undergraduate research on campus at various levels. And so I think like the McNair and these other big partnership ones to have faculty that have been engaged to a certain extent in some of those could be evidence. And the fact that we're asking them to write about it also I think is really important, because then we can actually start understanding the variations in terms of what people are doing in their commitments. So I'm glad to see that's part of since we've invested so much, and we are really hiring those president's postdocs. And by the way, I'm a president's postdoc from way back. Way back, before there was a hiring incentive. So I went to the University of Michigan. Go ahead.
Yeah, it was really interesting when you're talking about your review process, and you now have your 4 buckets instead of 3. There's been great pushback in many areas of review to say, no, we only want to have 3 criteria, because you could ever expand and each person would have that extra bucket they want to have. But the idea of having 3 major buckets and then putting other things like mentoring either in the teaching bucket, it could be in the surface bucket, or it could even be in the research bucket, depending on how it was characterized by the individual. Have you, so I know that when I did my file for review last time, I had 4 statements, and this last time I ended up with 3, because it was easier for me to describe my diversity, equity, and inclusion work within each of the areas, whereas the first time it was much easier to describe it as an individual. And so I think we have to be thinking about multiple ways of doing this to allow people to do right, that it worked best for you to have these 4 different buckets. But I know that there is concern about that ever expanding.
Yeah. So I want to say, correct it, is that I put it in those buckets because that's what CAP understands or barely understands. But really my work is integrated all through. And so I think we just need to start the norm of integrating it throughout. But right now they expect this separate diversity statement. And I get it, it's for people who don't have anything else, that don't really think about it when they're writing about the other buckets. So that's what it looks like now. But really, it is much more integrated, at least for my work. But I would imagine many other faculty of color, their work is much more integrated in terms of their mentoring and how it affects their research, and it's also part of service. One of our interviewees talked about it as part of service. We always think about it as that. But you know, when you think about mentoring at the graduate level, that graduate student is advancing my research and their own research at the same time. So it really is part of the research component as well. Yeah.
So I don't know if I have a specific question, but it's an observation both about the presentation, but also the conversation that's come up, and that's having to do with, and it sort of echoes what Susan Rivera was asking about, and that's the evaluation of these things. So far the conversation about presenting, like we as individuals can think about, or APAM could recommend how to present this information, but it really comes down to how the information that's presented by faculty, either in applications for faculty positions or for merit and promotion, how it's evaluated, and so the evaluators need to be trained. So
Yes.
my experience, my question or observation, whatever you want to characterize this, it really comes out of, I chaired the FPC in my college for 2 years, and there was a constant sort of tension between where the information was presented and how it was evaluated, in which bucket. And especially in the STEP Plus system, this can have a really significant impact. And nobody who served on my committee had done anything more than STED training for equity, and so there's, and that was before we developed the workshop on merit and promotion. So it's really essential to think about not just how to change the policies to ask people to present or what should be presented for evaluation, but how the evaluators are then trained and set up and supported to do those evaluations.
Yep, that's a very important question, because I always think, yeah, the conversations on CAP we're not always privy to, though we do know some people who serve, and they tell us more and more about what's going on. And, you know, right now I hear, at least on our campus, that they're not exactly sure what to do about the diversity part. I was like, okay, you know, but we're all required to do it now. So I think it's their turn to step up and really come up with a creative way of handling it.
Hi, thank you for that. It's sort of a question, and it's broader, and it's something I've been grappling with. I'm hoping that you have some thoughts on this. But maybe part of the problem with folks not knowing what to do with the diversity statement goes back to the graphic that you had at the beginning, where you were tracking out the way that people think in terms of research, teaching, service, and then this diversity sidebar. It reminds me of the social studies textbooks that I had when I was in middle school, where it's like, here's history, and then here's this sidebar of, oh, look, and there were Latino people, or there were Black people, or there were Native people. It's a sidebar, right? This is a sidebar.
It is.
And it's an ill-defined sidebar. Whereas the next graphic that you provide us with
More
shows
integrated.
integration of diversity. And I would actually say maybe what we're integrating is equity, because if we have equity, equity will produce through the talents and the initiative of underrepresented folks, it will produce diversity and inclusion, right? In my school in social sciences at UCI, where I'm the Associate Dean for Faculty Development and Diversity, it's a new position, and there was some discussion about what do we call this position. In a lot of schools, it's the equity and diversity person, right? And I pushed hard against framing it that way, and in discussion with the other associate deans in the school, reached a consensus that we were going to rethink the way that we framed this at the school. We have an associate dean for undergraduate studies, we have an associate dean for graduate studies and research, and now we have me, faculty development and diversity. Mine specifically says and diversity, but we agreed that theirs now say, at least in our understanding, undergraduate studies and diversity, graduate students and diversity. In other words, and diversity is built into everyone's mandate, right? So my job is to work to help faculty succeed and be happy, and part of that means using an equity framework, right? So maybe really what we ought to be doing is not sticking on a diversity statement, but explicitly reframing our metrics for how we evaluate, as my colleague over here said. How are we evaluating what is excellence in research, teaching, and service, right? And that if you're not doing it in a way that explicitly promotes equity, it's not excellent, right? Anyways, I think there was a question in there.
Can I just respond? I promise to keep this comment brief, but I think it's important to put this into our conversation. It really reminds me of what we've been having to consider for the COVID impacts, right? This ARO, or achievement relative to opportunity. So I think that I love the idea of weaving diversity into the fabric of all that we do, and I try to do that very consciously in my own work and in my department. But we also have to be very mindful about that, because there are disciplines and there are scholars who do incredible work related to diversity in their service or in their teaching, but not in their research. And we want to make sure that they don't get penalized for that. So we want to be purposeful about not building another widget that just moves, us into a different equity space, right? So we want to make sure that So I just wanted to weave that in so that it's top of mind, that it's not the same for everyone. And for some people, weaving diversity into the research may not be possible. That's okay, right? Because they may be amazing mentors or do amazing campus service.
That's what we actually have been saying recently, is that we've been saying equal treatment is not equity. It can maintain the inequities in place and erases individuals' backgrounds and needs and some of the areas they may be special. Yeah.
I think that that's a very sensitive and important point, but I think I disagree a little bit. I do think that, some of us do research. I'm a race and ethnicity and immigration historian, so my research obviously explicitly addresses some of these themes, right? But I do think that no matter what the topic of your research is, there are ways when we think of research as a holistic practice of demonstrating that you are thinking about equity and inclusion and diversity in it, right? Like you could talk about what efforts do I make to include underrepresented minority students in my labs, right? Or there are different ways of thinking about it, right? Well, I mean, I guess maybe. And, you know, maybe we need a metric that says excellent faculty must demonstrate explicit contributions to equity, diversity, and inclusion in one of these categories or two of these categories. Or, you know, the how we frame it, I think, is discussable. But the idea that anybody can have a career now in a public land-grant institution and not be explicitly advancing equity, diversity, and inclusion in some way, yeah, yeah.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll have 10-minute break.
Thank you so much. I just want to be mindful if somebody in the Zoom land has been waiting, that we're not only here in person. If not, then thank you so much, Professor Hurtado. I would like to ask very briefly about faculty-to-faculty mentoring and how culturally aware mentoring, and whether you've engaged in any research related to that, and some learning lessons on how we incorporate it at that level to support faculty retention. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very good point, because I don't, let's just say a lot of assistant professors have not found their mentoring committees that effective for them, but others have been really well served and it's working well. So it's another area that's like a slippery thing we haven't really got a big handle on. We're hoping with a culturally aware mentor training, because the faculty are training and they're going back, and right now we're focusing on those that have graduate students so that they can actually practice some of their mentoring on that. It actually changes their perspective and worldview, because it's not just about the student they're mentoring. They learn broader issues about how identity is so important to individuals. And it's a great source of pride, but also a source of pain, because of the status inequalities, et cetera, right? So we train them to think about those things. We do train them to think of systemically, but also to understand more about the processes involved. And so I think we haven't done the studies yet on faculty mentoring, but it's a really important step forward. And we think the big part is really getting them to understand the main concepts. And from there, I think you can think about how they're applied in the other way. And particularly, we have the strategies we're giving them about communication. It's going to help them with their colleagues. But these departments have really difficult things. By the way, from our climate measures that we've used in the department, we realized there were about 10% of the respondents that skipped all of the climate questions, which means they were afraid they were going to be identified if they revealed that their department lacked policies and practices that addressed EDI issues, if they felt resistance about diversity, resistance about mentoring, even having conversations about that. So we had a lot of measures of kind of a hostile climate, but also some positive ones in terms of faculty supporting diverse candidates in hiring, et cetera. But we are seeing that there's a group of people that are skipping them because they think the risks are there. So.